So today, as we read Corinthians, we are entering a new phase of the letter. So chapters 11 to chapters 14, the end of chapter 14, is a whole section that Paul starts to address the issues of worship and what was going on in the worship gatherings of the Corinthians. And not all of it was good, as we're about to see when we read it. The other thing just to have at the back of your mind is that Paul's responding to a letter probably that the Corinthian church would have sent to him, and also reports that he's heard from various places. Chloe's household is mentioned earlier on in the letter and stuff like that. So we're getting one half of a conversation. And one of the things that means is it's sometimes difficult to interpret exactly what Paul is addressing and what therefore he means. But let's have a crack at it. So first of all, there's this really controversial section, it's very controversial today, about whether women should have their head covered in worship. And there's a New Testament scholar called Richard Hayes who writes some really helpful things on this. First of all, he acknowledges that it's notoriously difficult to interpret this passage, partly because of everything I've just said. But then he goes on and he says, there are 4 things we can be very clear about. And I found this really helpful when I read it. The first thing is that Paul endorses the freedom of women to pray and prophesy in the gathered assembly. So the only question is whether they should wear a headdress. That's the area of controversy here. It's not whether they have freedom to pray or prophesy, it's just whether they should have their head covered. The second thing he says is when you read the stuff that talks about how men are, man is the head of the woman, and the things that you're talking about in verses 7 to 9, that's actually counterbalanced by what you read in verses 11 to 12, because it also goes on in those verses to really importantly stress that men and women are not independent of one another, and just as woman came from man, which is what Paul said earlier, so also man is born from woman. And so in God there is this interdependence rather than there being a hierarchy in the same way. The third thing to get is that the passage does not suggest women should be subordinate to men, even though some of Paul's arguments might seem to suggest that on the surface, but it does say that there is a distinction between the two sexes. So it does acknowledge that men and women are not exactly the same and identical, but it doesn't in any way suggest that what that means as a consequence is that women should be subordinate to men. And the fourth thing is that the main concern of the passage, the immediate concern, is to avoid the Corinthians bringing any shame on the community. And this helps us address the headscarf issue. Why today do women not wear headscarves in church? Why is it that when we walk in there's this hair just everywhere? The reason for that is because in the context that Paul's writing, women that would have their hair loose in a religious setting would often be either shrine prostitutes, or they would be associated with the goddess Isis. There was a big cult to a goddess Isis that was around in Corinth, and one of the things that was notorious about the followers of the goddess Isis was that the women would have their hair long and flowing to their shoulders. We have all sorts of archaeological records that tell us that. So Paul just doesn't want them to be confused with the worshippers of this different goddess, and he's just concerned that in the culture that they have, they maintain kind of a dignity and what's appropriate for that context. And today, because the cultus of the goddess Isis and shrine prostitutes are not a major problem, I don't think this need for headdresses applies in our setting and in our culture. Now, what might be the case is if everyone turned up wearing swimsuits to church, we might say, hey, this is just not appropriate, because in our culture people would associate that with going to the beach or just whatever. So if everyone turned up to church and the whole church was wearing swimwear, we would probably say, look, just put some clothes on. And it's that kind of principle. It's in the culture we're in. We want to try and be respectful and understand it. That's just to explain one part of what is an interesting passage today.